Hello, and welcome back to Ling 517, Coronavirus Edition. We're going to be narrating some slideshows, as I'm doing in class, more or less, but I'm going to probably give a little bit shorter lectures online here and allow you to stop and take a look at things in more detail if you decide that's a good way to proceed. We're starting a new unit this week, which is about critical periods in language acquisition. And this first presentation is going to be about the notion of a critical period, what it means, what it's about, where it comes from in terms of biology, and what it might mean for language acquisition. We're going to be mainly focused on first language acquisition in this lecture or this slideshow. And then in the next one, we'll turn to the question of second or other foreign language acquisition in critical periods. And we'll see that the two fields or the two sets of questions are a little bit different, but they're based in the same general idea. So we're going to more focus on first languages today. Anyhow, let's first get some background on what the critical period hypothesis is and what it's about. First observation here, and you'll hear me say things like this a lot in linguistics and in cognitive science, ask 4 different people what the critical period hypothesis is, and you'll get 4 different answers. So here is Wikipedia. A critical period is a maturational stage in the lifespan of an organism during which the nervous system is especially sensitive to certain environmental stimuli. So this is clearly geared towards biology. There doesn't seem to be anything terribly relevant to language in that statement at all, although part of your nervous system, it should be noted, is your brain. And if we assume that all the learning that we're doing and all the knowledge that we're gaining happens in some ultimate sense in the brain, then perhaps we could imagine that the brain goes through a sensitive or a critical period with regard to learning languages. And in fact, that's precisely what the linguistic version of the critical period hypothesis is about. So here's Christophe Pallier in his nice overview article that I asked you to read on the course website here. Here's his very simple statement, and this is really a very general and it's sort of a common statement of what the critical period says for language in particular. Humans are more efficient at language learning in the first years of life. Right? Totally seemingly straightforward, simple statement here. Here's some slightly different versions. So Bialystok and Hokuta, who are more interested in non-native language acquisition or second or foreign language acquisition, state this explicitly in terms of the brain. So maturational changes in the brain that alter the possibility of successful acquisition, that's what a critical period is, according to them. And then finally, Johnson and Newport, in this interesting paper that we'll definitely take a look at for the second language part of this, state the critical period hypothesis as they understand it to be proposed by Eric Lenneberg as language can only be acquired within a critical period extending from early infancy until puberty. Right? So this is in some ways much more specific, and this is based on the biologist Eric Lenneberg, who was the first one to try to apply this notion of a critical period from biology to first language acquisition, it should be noted. And this was in the context of Lenneberg's intellectual partnership with Noam Chomsky. Although Lenneberg was not himself a linguist, he thought that Chomsky's ideas about universal grammar had interesting implications for the biology of people and for cognitive science. And so he wrote a book about this in the 60s, about critical periods in first language acquisition and their relationship to biology. So this was what he thought was happening here. So there's a certain amount of sort of give or take here. People don't necessarily agree as to exactly what the critical period hypothesis says, but there are some common threads in here that we'll find coming up in most of the papers, most of the literature that we'll look at in this section. I think this statement by Christophe Pallier, the very simple one here, is going to be a useful starting point because among other things, it will sort of show us, I'm going to actually take the specific one from Johnson and Newport here as a starting point because it will show us, even with this fairly narrow and specific statement of the critical period, there's lots of room for interpretation. So I think this is a fairly common statement of what most people in the language sciences think the critical period hypothesis says. language can only be acquired, and I've added here like a native, within a critical period extending from early infancy until puberty. So I'm going to take that as a starting point, and note that even though this is in some ways more specific than some of the other statements we just saw, it's still very, very vague and ambiguous. And this ends up being important because we're going to find that actual real researchers doing actual real research have interpreted this in a number of different ways, and have that's had very different consequences for both what kinds of questions you're asking in your research and for how you interpret the results of that research. So some of the key terms in this sentence in particular could be understood in a number of different ways. And when you combine all these points of ambiguity, you end up with a number of different critical period hypotheses. And of course, if you're moving to the next step already and thinking about, well, how could you possibly test that critical period hypothesis? The answer is presumably going to be different depending on which version of the statement you've come up with in the first place. So maybe pause the video now and take a minute to just think about different points of ambiguity in this sentence, in this statement of what the critical period hypothesis is. What are some of the unclear constructs or terms in here? What are different ways of understanding them? And what would be the resulting critical period hypotheses? So take a minute and do that. So let's start with the first word in the statement, language, right? And as we've already noted in here, this is already a giant concept. In general, people like Pallier and Lenneberg are surely using the term language to denote a level one, a MAR level one type of concern. That is, the computational properties of a system, information processing system that humans possess, right? So this is really about implicit knowledge, right? So what this means, among other things, is that there's a statement here that the entire system of implicit knowledge that governs all of our linguistic behavior is not going to be exactly the same in somebody who acquired a language during their critical period versus somebody who didn't. But already that can mean a lot of different things. So this is not even a statement about specific behaviors. There's no way to go out and test somebody doing something and say, hey, I just tested their language, right? Not in this sense of language. And what that means is that any number of things could be the same or different. Right? It's going to differ very much if we're talking about specific linguistic behaviors or if we're talking about systems of knowledge that govern those behaviors. It's going to presumably differ if we're talking about perceptual activities, the ability to perceive things versus the ability to produce things, understand things, and so on and so forth. It's going to maybe differ if we're talking about phonetic properties versus syntactic ones versus semantic ones. There's lots and lots and lots of things that are subsumed under this cover term, language. And specific linguistic behavior is only ever going to give us a very limited window into what the underlying system of implicit knowledge looks like. And so already you can imagine a lot of different empirical domains that could matter for trying to test a critical statement like that. Right, then there's this term can only be acquired like a native. And I'm put like a native in there because I impute that to both Lenneberg and Johnson and Newport's paraphrase of him. It's clearly that they're preoccupied not with the ability to learn a foreign language, but the ability to learn a language like a native speaker of that language. And of course, this is already pretty problematic, right? Because every native speaker is going to be slightly different. How do we judge whether somebody has acquired a language exactly like a native? Do we see whether they fall within the range of native speakers for one particular measurement? That really doesn't establish anything, right? That might have just been a test that wasn't good at distinguishing between native and non-native speakers. Native speakers themselves will have a range of variation, right, in their own linguistic abilities, and especially if you're using experimental tasks to try to probe their implicit knowledge, that's an inherently noisy and messy activity. There's going to be lots of variation. How do you know if somebody is a native speaker who just had a bad day with this test or whether they're performing like a non-native speaker? There's a lot of ambiguity and noise that comes in at that point. So critical period itself is what we're trying to define, so I won't pick apart the vagueness of that. That's what we're doing for this entire slideshow. But even this last part about extending from early infancy until puberty is somewhat ambiguous. It's somewhat ambiguous what that means. So first of all, there's the question of how early in early infancy and how late in puberty. Puberty is not a time point. It's a developmental process that, again, every human starts going through at a different age and finishes going through at a different age. It's also unclear if this is the critical period. It's like a window opening. Do you need to get all of your linguistic exposure during that window? Do you just need to get some of it? Is there a critical amount of exposure that you need to get during that window? What does it mean for a critical period to extend from this time period to that time period, right? What does that mean? Does it just mean, hey, as long as you get some input between early infancy and puberty, you're going to acquire the language like a native? It's hard to know any of these things, right? The statement, language can only be acquired like a native within a critical period extending from early infancy until puberty, that statement doesn't come with a decoding mechanism to translate what the intent is behind that statement. So each one of these possibilities is going to have a variety of implications for how we might test critical period hypotheses and for what we might conclude from the results of those tests. And we're going to see that playing out more so in the second language acquisition area, a little bit less so in the first language acquisition area. But it's going to be the cause of some pretty, scurrilous disputes, some pretty spirited debates, at least in that second language literature. There seems to be a number of people arguing with one another there who have really genuinely hard feelings about this and are disagreeing strongly and seem very upset by it. I'm not sure why that is, but we'll get there eventually, and we'll see the kinds of misunderstandings that abound in that literature. For now, let's back up a bit and think about some more preliminaries here. So this idea of a critical period and the term critical period itself, this comes from biology. And there's a number of different kind of classic examples of critical periods in biology. And I am, not even close to being an expert on any of these things, but I'll give you like my 2-sentence summaries of some of these. And the point here is not that I'm giving you super accurate biological information. I'm not an expert. But the point here is just to show that these have slightly different properties from one another. And they have slightly different properties from human language, but they're still a good guide for thinking about how we might investigate critical periods in language, because this is where the notion itself is grounded. This is where it comes from. So one classic example of critical periods in biology is imprinting. And I'll show you a quick slide on that later. This was discovered by the biologist Konrad Lorenz in the early 20th century, or the 1930s or so. And it is particularly well known in birds and especially ducks, because that was what Lorenz used. And what imprinting refers to is that early in a chick's life, I think it's within the first 18 hours after they're born, they are in some sense hardwired to go looking for a mid-sized visual figure with roughly the color of a duck. And then they latch onto that duck and follow it around forever, because that is meant to be their mother. Right? And under normal biological conditions, that's exactly what the target of imprinting will be. It will be the chick's mother, and then all of the little baby ducks follow around the mother duck, and this is a biologically favored behavior. And yeah, there's supposed to be a window of about, I think it's 18 hours after hatching, during which a chick can imprint on its mother. And we'll see a number of twists about that. Well, let me say this now. Generally, one of the pieces of evidence there is that chicks start this behavior incredibly early, usually within a day after hatching. So that's already a clue that probably something biological is going on here. And then the other piece of evidence is that in unusual or aberrant cases, where the duck or the chick is deprived of the proper stimulus, you'll find that this imprinting can end up targeting an unexpected object and working out rather differently. So that's the other kind of evidence that this is biologically hardwired. If you change the input during this critical period, you get strange and lasting effects on biological output of the process. excuse me for 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. A second classic example in this in biology of a critical period is the development of binocular vision. That is the ability to coordinate the images from your two eyes together in order to form a single unified visual field of the world around you. And in particular, this is important in perceiving depth, perceiving how close or far away things are. And this was implicit when we talked about Marr's chapter where he was talking about vision. He always talked about it as mapping a two-dimensional retina. Like your retina itself is two-dimensional. It has a two-dimensional grid of cells, and yet you're somehow mapping it onto a three-dimensional world that we live in. And this is a somewhat computationally complex procedure, and it's something that can't be done except with some kind of an inference system, right? Because you can only see in two dimensions because your eyes are basically two-dimensional. You're going to need to combine images in some way in order to reconstruct that third dimension. And mammals learn to do this at a very, very young age. And in particular, there was a series of honestly pretty gruesome experiments on cats in the 1960s and 70s that showed exactly how this critical period for binocular vision worked. And here, the critical evidence was, again, if you let things run their normal course, then every normal non-pathological cat will end up having the exact same binocular vision, more or less. You know, some cats probably see better than other cats, but they all have this basic ability to see in three dimensions, unless something goes horribly wrong. And the second piece of evidence here, again, is going to come from deprivation, just like in the imprinting example, except here it's going to be total deprivation. And so in these frankly unethical experiments that would probably never be allowed nowadays, they took newborn cats and they sewed one of their eyes shut at birth. They then lacked the requisite input in one eye in order to develop normal binocular vision. The eyes were unsewn at some gestational age. I think it was maybe 6 weeks. And those cats never developed normal depth perception. So that was the crucial evidence that this was a critical period, is showing that, hey, if you take away the input during that period, then the output of the system, the knowledge that allows you to see in three dimensions, never develops properly or never develops like a native cat seer, right? Something like that. Those binocular vision experiments were just one of a series of really disturbing and experiments on cats and cat brains in particular that probably would never be allowed nowadays, but that did teach us an extraordinary amount about the mammalian brain and visual system. The last example I have here is vocal learning, and this is simply the ability to imitate others around you making noise. Right? And that's a very broad definition, but it certainly would include humans, although there's also a number of other animals that have some ability to do vocal learning. That said, it's pretty rare in the animal kingdom. There's not a lot of animals out there that can do vocal learning, but there are some, and in particular, there's a number of birds that can do vocal learning. So there's several kinds of birds with regard to their vocalization systems. Some birds basically have innate songs, and they're born and they develop those songs the same way that you would develop a liver or something like that. There's no geographical variation in those songs. They're just something that comes by instinct or something like that. A number of other bird species, however, do learn songs from the songs being sung around them. In particular, there's said to be a critical period for birds that learn songs, that show vocal learning. There's a critical period in which those songs have to be learned. And so as you would expect, if you're born as a bird in this particular island and not that particular island, then you get slightly different input about what songs sound like, you end up singing your songs slightly differently. So you get variation from island to island in how these songs are sung. And that's different from other bird species that don't do vocal learning. So again, the evidence for this is that if you leave them alone, every normally developing, I think finches show this kind of vocal learning, every normally developing finch will learn the songs that are being sung around it in a normal way. And this happens pretty early in life, therefore critical period. And then again, the crucial evidence comes from deprivation here. So there's a number of reasons, some of them natural and some of them experimental, why a bird that normally shows vocal learning might be isolated from other conspecifics, from other birds of its species. And when that happens, it's fairly well established that they just don't learn a normal bird song at all. They learn what's sometimes called a stereotyped call or bird song, which is much, much simpler and lacks all of the distinctive characteristics of a real bird song. Right? So again, crucial evidence here is you take away the input from these organisms, and the output of the system, a well-formed bird song, never develops properly. So each of these examples is slightly different. They're all interesting, and they all suggest a variety of possible analogies to what's going on in human language. Here is a sort of linking idea between critical periods in biology and the idea of universal grammar. So this is the way I understand the critical period to often be thought of in language sciences. UG says that our language acquisition device is biologically specified, right? This goes back to the Noam Chomsky reading we did earlier this semester. The idea that your manner of learning a language, the kinds of biases and the kinds of predispositions that you bring to bear on learning a first language are part of the universal human genetic endowment. So UG is biologically specified in that sense. The critical period hypothesis says that our developmental biological capacities are only available during certain maturational windows or critical periods of time. And if we don't use them during those windows, then we never get the system of knowledge that we're supposed to come out with. Right? If that's true of UG in particular, or a language acquisition device, then it shouldn't be available after a certain age. So that definitely has implications for first language acquisition. Right? If you're just deprived of input, like a finch who hears no songs, or a cat who's had one of its eyes sewn shut, then your maturation will never be entirely typical or normal or native in this regard. What about L2 acquisition? So take a moment and think about that. Pause if you want to. Well, this doesn't really say anything about second language acquisition. So you might think at first, well, in order to be acquired like a native, that second language might also need to be acquired during the critical period, but there's nothing about the critical period hypothesis that actually says that. The critical period hypothesis most straightforwardly says if you don't get exposed to a language during the critical period, then you lose the ability to acquire a language natively. It doesn't say anything about what happens if you do get exposed to a language during the critical period. Maybe it still shuts off after puberty, or maybe you just retain that ability for the rest of your life. Right? There's no particular implication about the general critical period hypothesis for acquisition of second languages or greater. Right? You could also imagine, well, maybe once you acquire a first language, it blocks you from acquiring a second language like a native. And that may or may not be true, but it doesn't follow in any way, shape, or form from the critical period hypothesis. Because again, this hypothesis doesn't straightforwardly say anything about second language acquisition, especially if we're grounding the idea in universal grammar. Where universal grammar, the idea that there are innate biases brought to bear on first language acquisition, that has absolutely nothing to say about second language acquisition. Chomsky has never written a word about second language acquisition and has made no predictions one way or the other about how it ought to work. So if you're basing your idea of a critical period on that Chomskyan UG theory, then it almost by definition makes no predictions about second language acquisition. That said, we'll see what people have made out of this in a variety of different ways in the next section of the class. Oh, sorry, I was already talking through this slide. I didn't realize the slide was actually in here. Yeah, the question here, does the critical period hypothesis make predictions about foreign language learning? Maybe. It depends on which critical period hypothesis you have in mind, and it depends on the difference between implicit and explicit learning. Right? And this is the point where if we were doing a live lecture, I would have you count small numbers of objects. Right? In particular, what you would see is that, well, hopefully if it worked out right, humans seem to have an innate implicit system for counting that extends up to about 7 or 8 objects, and you can instantly, like that, just acquire the number of objects in a visual array up to about 7 or so. We also have a system for doing addition. That one is explicit. At some point, everybody in this class was taught in a classroom how to do addition. Right? And if I hold up a picture of 5 objects, you can instantly count that with your innate numerosity. And if I hold up another one of 4, you can instantly count that with your innate numerosity. And then if I hold up both of them together and ask you how many, you'll be able to answer that quickly, but not anywhere near as quickly, because that's going to rely on your ability to add 5 and 4, which is slow. Your ability to recognize 5 or recognize 4 is almost instant. Right? So implicit and explicit learning are very, very different. Whether you think that the critical period hypothesis applies to second language acquisition is going to depend on whether you think that second language acquisition is fundamentally like first language acquisition or fundamentally unlike first language acquisition. Right? And I'm not going to take a strong position on that in here. I know for sure that there are some differences between first and second language acquisition. Do they have anything in common? I'm not really sure, but whether or not the critical period applies to second language learning is going to depend on the answer to that question. So let's give a sort of tight and falsifiable statement of critical periods for first language acquisition first. And here's my attempt. If a child does not acquire a first language by the end of some critical period, then they will never acquire a first language normally. This is a very much more straightforward statement here. It's based on an entailment. It's related to the biological cases, and it specifies that we're talking about first languages versus no languages in particular. I'm going to call that the critical period for first language acquisition. The rest of this slideshow will be about that question. Although I think I'm going to now split this off into a separate file just in case you want to take a pause here and review.